Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. This is Inner Balance TV, and I'm your host, Dwayne Hartman. What if there were technologies that we already own, we already have? What if we could travel to any place at any time? And what if those technologies were actually being used right now? We're taking these flights to Mars to investigate the surface. But yet, there are people that say that they've already been to Mars, that they've been involved in a group that travel to Mars and have traveled to Mars in a project called Project Pegasus. We're going to hear a very interesting interview tonight with Andrew. And in this interview, we're going to hear some things that may enlighten you a little bit as to how far along our technology has advanced. And in fact, it's been more advanced than we know since even the 40s. And where Tesla technology has taken us. So let's move on to the interview with Andrew. Well, hello, Andrew. It's nice to have you on Inner Balance TV. Thank you for coming.
Hi, Dwayne. It's good to be with you this afternoon.
You have had an amazing life experience with what's happened to you with being teleported. You've actually went to different places, different times. And this was through the Pegasus project. Is that correct?
Right. I'm 51. I've actually had a very mundane life, but I have had 8 years of very non-ordinary experience. First, 4 years in childhood serving in DARPA's Project Pegasus, which was the U.S. time space program at the time of the emergence of time travel. And then during my college years at UCLA, I served in the CIA's Mars Jump Room program. So I'm really just an ordinary lawyer practicing in Washington State. I grew up in New Jersey and came of age in California. And now I'm practicing law in Washington. But what I've done is I've gone back and investigated what happened to me in these two very significant defense technical projects. And admittedly, I now appreciate, and this is in fact one of the reasons I came forward, I had really extraordinary life experience in those two projects. And I believe that humankind deserves to understand what we did in those two projects.
Because here we are going to Mars with probes, and you've already been there.
Yes, in fact, I first went to Mars via jump room from a Hughes aircraft facility in El Segundo, California. I don't have the precise date, but it was the month of July 1981 when I was 19, right, after having been trained the previous summer of 1980 to go. So here we are, it's 2013. 32 years have passed since I first went there, and I was by no means the first Mars jumper. Right. Well, I played more of a pioneering role as the first American child to teleport during Project Pegasus for a complicated number of reasons. I may have been the 100,000th or so American to be sent to Mars via jump, if we're to believe what my class was told during our training in summer of 1980. So we were sending a lot of people.
Yeah. Because I've heard you mention on other interviews the numbers of people that are actually there.
Well, David Wilcock is a bright physicist and a fairly cautious researcher, and he estimates that there are now as many as 550,000 Earthlings in the secret U.S. colony on Mars.
Right.
Going back to the early 1980s when we were trained at a seminar at College of the Siskiyous held by the CIA to prepare us for our trips to Mars beginning the next summer, the summer of '81, we were told that of the 97,000 individuals that had at that point been sent to Mars, only 7,000 had survived after 5 years. So those must have been the individuals that they were attempting to settle on Mars in very brutal conditions.
Oh, okay.
So I think literally the secret Mars program may explain many of the missing adult person cases in the country. For the late 70s, because a lot of people have been sent. I mean, 500,000 people is a small city. Vancouver, Washington, I think we have a population of 100,000. So
right.
That's almost as many as had been sent when I was sent in July of 1981.
And there's facilities there. I remember hearing Jessica Mystic, a friend of mine, she interviewed you. And I went through the whole and listened to the whole interview, and you had mentioned about when you went there. There's already a facility there. There's a bunker.
There were a set of jump room receiving facilities that were relatively small buildings. They weren't tiny, and they weren't just the size of the jump room. But if you can imagine, about the size of an auto dealership, where you need enough floor space to maybe put out 8 models of car.
Right.
And there's an elevator maybe up to a second floor where there's some sofas or whatever to sit around and talk to the salesman. It was sort of that size of the building. And those housed the elevator that received the jump room that had been sent there by the elevator on Earth. And there were 4 or 5 of those, but there weren't the large cavernous buildings that, for example, there's a photograph that my good friend Robert Odin, the ufologist, shared for the first time at the European Exopolitics Summit in Barcelona, Spain in the summer of 2009. And that building is about the size of, let's say, a library at a major university, a major university research library, let's say. And it's a sprawling facility, and Bob Dean understands that that's one of the U.S. facilities at the present time on Mars. But when we were going up there, we were pretty much fending for ourselves in a quasi-frontier environment. Because while the defense contractors involved, which I know was the Ralph M. Parsons company, because I was the son of a Parsons engineer who was on the project, and at one point we saw actually things that had been done by engineers and construction workers under the direction of Parsons, but also Hughes Aircraft. They had built some of these jump room facilities, but the rest of the surface of Mars was relatively uncultivated by human hands. I mean, there were a lot of ancient structures and artifacts, primarily from the Martian civilization before the solar system catastrophe of 9500 BC,
okay,
which are still on the surface. But in terms of contemporary facilities that we could have sought shelter in, I mean, the only time that happened during my 40 or more trips there was I was caught in a dust storm with Courtney M. Hunt of the CIA and my young fellow jumper William B. Stillings, and we kind of waited out that dust storm in a rudimentary sheet metal or aluminum sort of hut, kind of like a Quonset hut.
Okay, yeah.
There were a few facilities like that, but we were often in completely exposed conditions where, twice I was standing within footsteps of one of the Martian predators that was devouring one of our team members. And although I had a flash gun, kind of a handgun on me to fend the smaller predators, that weapon would be of no use against the larger predators. They were simply too big. And I was simply talking to the predators, come over and don't, if you come over here, don't eat me. In other words, we were pretty much just exposed to the kinds of conditions that frontiersmen and women are exposed to, which would be, conditions of great thirst without water, conditions of hunger without food, the risk of being eaten by or killed by dangerous predators, of stepping on things that could injure us, a snake, a tear of some kind.
Were you in suits, or were you? Can you just walk around in the environment there?
When I first went up, I had received some specialized training after the basic sort of cognitive or educational preparation in summer of '80. Then in the summer of '81, I was given actual operational training in things like how to operate a respirator on the surface, how to use my weapon, when to use the cyanide capsule that I'd been given as a suicide pill if I faced inevitable death as a result of being within the proximity of one of the inevitably lethal predators, different ways of orienting myself on the surface, and especially, we were essentially Pavlovian conditioned to look around every 30 seconds.
Okay.
We were trained sort of like combat infantry to look in this direction to the left and then do a 180 and look behind us and then do a 90-degree turn and just make sure that we were not within range of any of the predators, including the non-lethal, inevitably potentially non-lethal ones. So the first time I went up, I had that respiration device, but I was met on the surface by 3 American chrononauts like myself who were up there. And I was interacting with one of them in particular, and I was yelling that they had no respirators on. And I was yelling, "Can I take off my mask?" And they were laughing, and I did, and I could breathe on the surface.
Okay. Wow. You had mentioned a couple of times now about these predators. Are these like burrowing predators? Like I've seen some images of somebody had taken some video footage of these of some sort of worm-like or burrowing. Is that exist up there, or is it?
We were trained that there are 30 large land animals on the surface of Mars. It's a very flat ecosystem with a lot of predation going on. And 5 or 6 are predators. I mean, they'll eat earthlings or human, primates on the surface. But only several were inevitably lethal. And the 2 that I saw were of the same species. They were about 16 feet tall. They looked like dinosaurs. They had heads like Tyrannosaurus rex with just as much teeth and just as jagged, but a narrower face, a narrower head as you looked on from the front. Mm-hmm. And they had very supple, muscular bodies, very much like the velociraptors depicted by Steven Spielberg in Jurassic Park. Mm-hmm. They were very fast. We saw one of them running at a speed estimated at 70 miles per hour, suddenly stopping and devouring a water buffalo-like creature on the surface. This was several 100 yards we were watching this just scream across the surface. And when those would scamper into a group of us, we had been trained that if they focused on us, we should run in erratic zigzag patterns because they might tire of chasing us and just scamper off. And both of the team members did that and ultimately sat down and then were bitten and devoured. And in fact, the first was about a 45-year-old man, and he was actually bitten in half in front of us. The second casualty was a teenage boy from Southern California who ultimately sat down and was bitten. So these were probably not dinosaurs. They were probably large reptiles. I say that because the plesiosaur species on Earth, which has a bulky body like a tortoise and a long neck like a snake, did not survive the KT extinction on Earth. But there are many plesiosaurs on Mars. In fact, I've shown them in my Mars photo analysis. For example, in my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, published in 2008, I showed 3 Martian plesiosaurs, or what I'm calling these terrestrial, as distinguished from the aquatic plesiosaurs on Earth, that are on Tsiolkovsky Ridge, west of the Home Plate Plateau,
okay,
in the Columbia Basin of the Gusev crater of Mars. So Mars is a mix of, there has to be common genetic heritage from either Earth or whatever produced life on Earth, because the species that are on Mars, the animal species, include species that are presently on Earth, mm-hmm. that were once on Earth and are extinct, or that have never been on Earth that we know of. Basically unidentified species that we can't recognize, and then also hybrids of both living and extinct Earth species. So when I make a reference to the Martian plesiosaur, I'm suggesting an animal like the aquatic plesiosaur on Earth before the case of extinction that has adapted to a terrestrial environment. There's a lot of that kind of mimicry. For example, there's one hybrid that I didn't see on Mars, but I found in NASA image PIA 10214 that is a hybrid of the upper torso and head and shoulders of a human being, a modern Homo sapien on Earth, and the lower extremities of a modern scorpion on Earth, or with the size of the lower extremities of a modern human adult on Earth. So,
and we've seen some of that imagery in ancient work, and ancient stonework, and that of a man scorpion.
Yes, in fact, in the High Egyptian pantheon, Serpent, who is the goddess of the harvest, or was the goddess of the harvest to the Egyptians, holding up a mysterious red orb that we believe is the planet Mars, is a female, and she is a hybrid between her upper half is an adult female human form, and then her lower half is that of a scorpion. So that's the result of cultural diffusion between Mars and Earth back before 11,500 years ago, when the High Egyptian civilization still existed and was in regular contact with the planet Mars.
Now, this is interesting because at one time there was some sort of communication or jumping that was going back and forth at that time, I would imagine.
We know there was, because we not only have the pioneering work of Hoagland, Baer, and Munch in studying the Sidona complex and seeing that it corresponds to the same Orion constellation-based form of the Giza Plateau in Egypt, encompassing the Great Pyramid. But my organization, more recently, working not from the satellite data, but from the rover data on the ground, our analyst Ross Curley found an intaglio in a Martian rock. In fact, oddly, it was found on Sol 2012 by the rover Spirit of our mission on Mars with the modern Mars exploration rover Spirit, Opportunity, and Curiosity. Ross found a perfect image of an Egyptian pharaoh carved into the rock. It has the typical conical headdress of the pharaoh, the cobra ready to strike motif at the bottom center of the headpiece, of the headdress, and a beard at the bottom of the chin, which is how the pharaohs were appointed in terms of their appearance. And this particular pharaoh possesses both European and African phenotype, basically physical appearance, or physiognomy, much as the president does. President Obama is both of European and African ancestry, and you can see it in his features. Well, this particular pharaoh, this is a very interesting find, because there was a period in the High Egyptian civilization where the Egyptians began adopting the children of the most successful warriors of the Ethiopians that they had contested in battle, and took them into their specialized academies and groomed them for the leadership of Egypt. And so there was a reign of black pharaohs, which I think shows a measure of the advanced nature of that High Egyptian civilization.
Yeah.
So we found not only a pharaoh, I mean, if we were faking the data, we would have made the face look more like the pharaohs that exist in a lot of the statuary and iconography of and hieroglyphics of the High Egyptian civilization. But in fact, it's a legitimate finding, it's an authentic finding, and it shows a black pharaoh. So we now have the fingerprint. I mean, we're referring to that as the Rosetta Stone of the High Egyptian presence on Mars, because it's not a close call. It literally looks like somebody carved the face of a pharaoh and then stamped it into a piece of metal. It's that clear.
Wow.
So, yeah, it's certain at this point that there was, in all likelihood, an interplanetary confederation between Earth and Mars, maybe in league with a third planet that fragmented, and that may have caused both planets to be devastated in that catastrophe of around 9500 BC. I mean, that event fractured Mars. It squished it into a spheroidal planet, more oblate than the planet Earth. It devastated the biosphere of Mars. It led to a huge flood that left a lot of the planet under mud that dried and caused Mars to become a desert planet. It knocked off most of the ionosphere of Mars, which is one of the reasons that the several typologies of Martian humanoids live underground, because their skin is not adapted to a terrestrial environment that's almost devoid of an ionosphere. So Mars is hit constantly by solar radiation that can be deleterious to the skin. But that also devastated Earth. That was the event that led to the Hopi creation myth, born of water. I mean, the earlier creation myth was Dragon Slayer, the event that, in all likelihood, caused the dinosaurs to become extinct. But the very recent catastrophic event that sort of led to a new flourishing of a new world on Earth, as human beings recovered over many thousands of years, roughly from around 9500 BC to around 3000 BC, when civilization then flourished in ancient Sumer, which is why we call the most pleasant season of the year in the northern hemisphere summer, and is in reference to ancient Sumer, kind of a golden age where civilization then recovered after 6,000 years of relatively advanced human beings living in caveman conditions for that epoch. So we're certain now that before that event, the previous Earth civilization centered in Egypt. It was actually a great maritime civilization that had major outposts in Mesoamerica and in Southeast Asia, and possibly in Eastern Europe. That first civilization on Earth that built the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx was on Mars. We have found its artifacts on the surface.
This is amazing, eh? Because I know not only have you jumped to Mars, but you've also went back in time. Have you ever gone to ancient Egypt yourself?
No. I went on prehistoric and ancient and medieval kinds of jumps via chronovisor, and also by a technique called plasma confinement when I was in Project Pegasus as a child. But most of the places we were sent to were fairly mundane. The only really illustrious time-space locations I was sent to is I was sent to the Gettysburg Address to try to see Abraham Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address, and for a very complex set of reasons I didn't. And I was sent to Ford's Theater the night of his assassination, and I was sent to brief General Washington, with the latter two events being via chronovisor, which is this electro-optical device that creates a hologram from which you would be in a past or future location.
Okay.
But I really wasn't sent to any of the places that would have interested in Edgar Cayce. I mean, I wasn't sent to ancient Egypt when the pyramids were being built, or to ancient China when the Great Wall was being built. My time travel experiences were training exercises, so they didn't want to place us in very stressful environments per se.
Yeah.
That would just disrupt our training.
Why do you think that they use children?
Well, I know why they used children in Project Pegasus for time travel. The first reason, in the 10 years, or now 13 years I've been investigating my experiences, I've identified the specific reasons because I was either told when I was trained or later by my father, or I figured it out. But the first thing we know is that they were testing Tesla teleportation on bright, healthy, sturdy children from stable families, just as for example, the children of the president would likely be. You know, when a man reaches the White House, usually he's accomplished enough. Most of our presidents have raised healthy children, if married. So they were planning on integrating Tesla teleportation into the national security system, namely place it at U.S. military bases around the world, to shuttle the president and his family and the vice president and the cabinet itself around planet Earth without any fatigue. So that, for example, Air Force One could take off and the president would be shuttled to a local military base, maybe Andrews, by car, teleport to, let's say, England, and then the plane would land at Heathrow, but he would actually be at a local military base having teleported there in seconds. It was hoped that would enable our executive branch officials to carry out our foreign policy and our diplomacy without the danger posed by things like jet lag or an accident in the air. So we know that the first reason for using children is they were testing Tesla teleportation to gauge the cognitive and physiological impacts on children around the same age that the typical first family children have been.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. The second reason is that the holograms in the chronovisors, which again were these electro-optical devices that produced a hologram so dense that it had the effect of lensing typically a past event into the laboratory.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when the chronovisor program began, the holograms that they were producing were so vulnerable to collapse, just like an early television picture could go on the blink.
Right.
They were so likely to respond to a noise, let's say somebody coughing or sneezing or saying something, that they found that the biological signature of an adult, namely heavier footfall, louder respiration, a heavier heartbeat, louder heartbeat, and louder noises like when talking or sneezing or coughing, were causing the hologram to collapse. So they knew that if they were going to use the chronovisors to perform quantum access, that is to use it as a technical remote viewing device, to either look at what was going on in a past or future scene, or send a chrononaut there to experience that environment directly as a result of being immersed in the hologram,
Mm-hmm.
that they made a decision that to train a cadre of gifted and talented American school children who were cooperative personalities and who were quick studies and who would have the courage and the capability to be immersed in the hologram and go to these primarily past locations in time. Because when I joined the program officially in the fall of 1969, they had not yet pushed the limit forward of the chronovisors of trying to get scenes from the future. They were already setting us back 12 hours in time when we test the teleporter back from New Mexico to New Jersey. But the chronovisors were still an experimental technology. Okay. So the second reason is they needed to use children, or they wouldn't have the benefit of the chronovisors for their intelligence mission, which was remote sensing in time,
Mm-hmm.
to give the American intelligence community the better information that it needed so that it could make intelligence recommendations to the rest of the executive branch of the U.S. government to engage the government in better contingency planning for current and future events. There's actually 5 reasons. The third reason is that we were trainees. They were planning to send us along to the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis after high school to involve us in more time-space travel. So we were basically not space cadets, but time-space cadets.
Mm-hmm.
And then the fourth reason is that they knew that children have very keen perception, so that as participant observers in the program, when we sensed something in time, when we looked, for example, at what somebody was holding in a holster on their belt, if it was a scientific instrument rather than a sidearm, the children would see that it was a scientific instrument, but adults would just sort of scan it quickly and presume it was a weapon.
Oh, okay.
We were viewed as tabula rasa, as blank slates, who would be able to give the CIA better information based on the time probe that DARPA was running us through. And then finally, later in time, toward the end of his life, in the late 80s, my father revealed that they had decided to train a cadre of children from childhood, because when they were using adults, for example, Navy enlisted personnel, after several experiences time traveling, they were often going insane.
Yeah.
Because of the psychologically deracinating effects of moving between times. So we were essentially being involved in time travel as youngsters in the same way that, let's say, if you teach a child how to scuba dive in childhood, by the time they're in their teens, they're doing it as second nature. It's a natural activity.
Right.
In terms of their worldview. So they were making time travel an ordinary activity for us so that when we grew up, we could cope with its effects.
Right. That's the part I thought probably one of the reasons would be the psychological flexibility of children to be able to see something like that and not be, adults would have a little bit tougher time.
Right, exactly. Children are malleable. They don't know what they can't do.
Yeah. Exactly.
and they believe what they can do. And so, on a certain level, um, on one level, it was a matter of utilizing that human potential of children.
Mm-hmm.
Children, for example, more than adults, have demonstrated things like levitation of small objects because they believe they can take their intent and move that object in the same way they can take their intent and reach over and lift the object. But after around age 7, when the critical faculty begins to characterize human cognition and the brain begins to differentiate and develop more crenulation, more wrinkling, there seems to be a loss of capabilities that are either vestigial potentials of the human race or incipient ones. We don't really know. We don't know if ancient man was levitating more than modern man, or whether future man is going to be doing things like using the human mind to achieve these kind of feats,
Right.
more than the typical contemporary human being can. But I was both reading minds and I was levitating small objects as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I was doing those things because I believed I could with 100% of certainty.
Right. Exactly.
And so that was a dimension of the program, was the innate special abilities of some children.
Now, this was is this Project Looking Glass? Is that what you?
Project Glass was either a later program or it's just a different name for the chronovisor dimension of Project Pegasus.
Okay.
Project Pegasus was under DARPA and involved 8 different modalities of time travel. And we know for certain that one of them was spun off into a separate program, and that was the Montauk Chair.
Okay.
It spun off into Project Montauk about 15 years after Pegasus began. The Montauk Chair is simply a magnetic transducer that boosts human consciousness forward in time so that people experience a 15 to 20 minute episode of their own subjective future.
Okay.
Now, in the case of the reference to Project Looking Glass that Dan Burrish established in his testimony to Project Camelot, because the Montauk Chair was spun off, if there was a Project Looking Glass, it would have involved spinning off the chronovisor, which had already been in use in Project Pegasus.
Okay.
I was sent to the past via chronovisor to different settings. I mean, I was sent to 100 million BC, at the time of the dinosaurs. I was sent into a Civil War battle. I was sent to the Five Points neighborhood of New York City in 1905. I was sent to the Netherlands, a rural setting in the Netherlands around 1800, and to Washington's encampment above New York Harbor in August of 1776, to Ford's Theater the night that Lincoln was shot there, and so forth. So I became well acquainted with chronometry. It was in major use in Project Pegasus when I was a child on the project in the late 60s and early 70s. What's strange, though, is when the 2 men operating these closed-circuit TV camera-like booms, who were emitting some kind of signal across the hologram when they were focusing the hologram, when they would leave their positions and go to lunch or whatever, the hologram would just cycle through random images. Sometimes it would even go outside the facility and then run along the ground and then make a left and then go into another time and you'd see another scene come up. In other words, it just circled through or cycled through random time-space locations, and that was pretty fascinating to watch.
I'll bet it was. Eh?
It was amazing. I mean, you'd see something from the colonial era in New Jersey, and then you'd see a car whisk by, and then it would make a left turn, and you'd see some kids from the 50s playing baseball out in some community park, and then it was just amazing.
And
but
this was
on a particular place to send us there, which they could do with great efficacy. But when they just left the equipment, it would cycle through a random scene.
Wow. And this was all birthed out of Tesla technology, wasn't it?
Well, according to 3 principals on the project, namely my late father, Raymond F. Basiago of the Ralph M. Parsons Company, Dr. Robert Beckwith, formerly of General Electric, and Jack Pruitt of the United States Navy, who was one of the team leaders in Project Pegasus, and who went on to be the research director for Project Montauk. The greatest debt of gratitude owed Project Pegasus, in terms of the derivation of its technologies that it was working with, its time travel technologies, was the work of Nikola Tesla. The papers that Tesla had left upon his death in New York City in 1943 were first sent to the National Archives under the Alien Property Act, but we know that from the National Archives they were then forwarded to Los Alamos, where the world's leading physicists were then gathering to build the atomic bomb under Project Manhattan. And there his paperwork stayed, and the bomb project and Tesla's time travel papers were essentially the basis for founding the Los Alamos National Laboratories, first as the Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory that had built the atomic bomb. Tesla's papers are still there. You need a special security clearance and an articulable reason to have access to his papers, but they're still there in Los Alamos. So in my work, I've revealed that essentially the U.S. time-space program, founded in the work of Nikola Tesla, and having operationalized different forms of time travel to the past and future by 1970, was essentially the secret twin of Project Manhattan, and the greatest debt of gratitude was owed to Tesla. But also, there were inputs from ancient technological sources, from contemporary foreign technology sources, namely the Nazi German and Soviet Russian, and then also from other contemporary geniuses like Ernetti and Gemelli, who discovered chronovision, Fermi, who joined their team and helped them perfect second dimensional chronovision, which led to third and fourth dimensional chronovision under Project Pegasus. And also, I would be remiss not to add a major input from extraterrestrial sources.
Okay, yeah.
So Project Pegasus was essentially the defense technical funnel where all those technical inputs were being put. But from the perspective of the principals on the project, when the project was underway, the project was essentially the fulfillment of the work of Nikola Tesla, 25 years after his death. So in a sense, I view my work in time travel advocacy, in whistleblowing about what we have accomplished in Project Pegasus, as essentially the bridge between the completion of Nikola Tesla's work by Project Pegasus and the application of some of these technologies to advantage humanity in the 21st century. You know, when I cross over to the other side, I want to shake Nikola Tesla's hand, because this is what I'm doing, why I'm doing what I'm doing. I mean, I want to cut the red ribbon at Nikola Tesla Grand Central Teleport in New York City. You know, he's the man. I mean, Tesla's work was repressed when he first came to the United States because he had solved a technical problem that Thomas Alva Edison had posed, and he went to Edison to pick up this $50,000 reward for solving the problem, and Edison cheated him on that bet, all the way through the manipulation by Edison and Westinghouse. Nikola Tesla's work was repressed at the time it emerged, and he became very defensive at being exploited for warfare purposes. So during that last 15 years of his life in New York City, where ostensibly he was just raising pigeons and sitting around in parks as a doddering old man, in fact, secretly he was developing the technology that's going to define the 21st century. And it's my mission to bring that information forward so that every child on Earth can teleport in the way that Nikola Tesla intended.
In teleportation, have you teleported to other planets?
We were being repositioned from Earth to Mars during my college years in the early 80s under the CIA's jump room program. But not only did I not go off planet when I was a child on Project Pegasus, but the lunar program and Mars only came up in the most passing ways. So, for example, I was shown data from Project Moondust, where we were planning to put rockets on the moon and then bury them and make habitat under the lunar surface with our rocketry. It was suggested to me by my father and some of the other principals that many of us would become astronauts. There was one, I believe it was X-ray satellite imagery. It may have been radio satellite imagery, and I have that wrong, but I thought they said X-ray satellite imagery that showed odd images of 4 little Martians jumping off of a rock on Mars and allowing themselves to be devoured by a large serpent, because essentially they were cornered. And I don't know why we were shown that when we were children on Pegasus, because we were never told per se. I mean, one time we were doing a kind of a tolerance test. We were in that whirlybird device where you're thrown in every angle, so
Right.
and they try to ascertain whether you can deal with disequilibrium and not vomit, basically. Well, we were put in one of those, and when one of the little girls went through it without getting sick to her stomach, she jumped out of the apparatus and said, "Does this mean we're going to be astronauts?" And they said, "Yes, some of you will be." So I think there was a plan to forward some of the children in Project Pegasus into the space program. But I know they were planning on sending many of us, continuing to involve many of us in the time space program, because there was a discussion between Donald Rumsfeld, who was then the former congressman, who was the defense attaché to Project Pegasus, basically the point man between the project principals like my father and the Department of Defense. And Rummy was telling my dad at a bar, when he was having his martini, my dad was having his Jack Daniels, and I was having my great knee-high, that they were planning on sending us all to Annapolis to use it as a pretext for involving us in future project activities. Mm-hmm. So I think that is kind of their thinking. Now, also, one of our fellow Mars jumpers went on to join the astronaut corps, and that was William Cameron McCool. Willie became a space shuttle pilot in 1996 when he and I were 35 years of age. That was going on 15 years after the Mars jumping program. Mm-hmm. So there was some, and also, of course, Regina Dugan became the director of DARPA. She was one of the Mars jumpers. Probably some of those jumpers had also served in Project Pegasus, but certainly in our peer group, I was known as the only jumper who had previously served as a time traveler in Pegasus. So these programs kind of have overlaps like that. You really never know what the government has up its sleeve in terms of what it's planned for you. I think in my case, they were, because I was sat down and told that I would be applying to Annapolis when I was in high school by my father, I believe that they wanted to send me to the Naval Academy to either train me to become a naval officer or continue project activities, or maybe both.
Mm-hmm. When I see the planets, each one of them in basically the same sort of destruction, or farmed out, or whatever, is anybody ever looking at Venus, the next planet?
Well, Ben Rich of Lockheed said that whatever you think the U.S. defense technical community might someday be able to do, even in hundreds of years, I'm kind of embellishing what he said. He said, basically, whatever you imagine you think we can do, we can do. We can even take E.T. home. Mm-hmm. So I believe now, 30 years after they were jumping us to Mars in a space elevator that had trans-chronological properties that defied contemporary laws of physics that are still being taught at the high school and collegiate level, I believe that our personnel are now outside the solar system. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exchange programs like Project Serpent have almost inevitably happened. Yeah. And I say that because look at where time travel was in 1970. Yeah. I mean, and in the sole photograph we captured Lincoln at Gettysburg. Mm-hmm. We were going to an elevator at 999 North Sepulveda in El Segundo, California in 1981, 2, 3, and 4, and standing in an elevator and stepping out of that elevator on the surface of Mars. So in the intervening, going on 35 years here in a couple of years, I think Ben Rich was basically being honest that we have very advanced technology. And that's another reason I'm speaking out, Dwayne, is if we don't harmonize the knowledge of these activities with general societal knowledge and activity, what has been spoken of as a major threat to our civilization, namely that we would evolve into a breakaway civilization where there would be a priesthood of individuals involved in specific technical activities, and then the general public around the world would be kept in the dark. I mean, I don't think that's a threat. I think that's happening. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The President of the United States, Barack Obama, was one of my colleagues in the Mars Jumper program. He's a same-age peer that I knew as a friend and colleague. He's a fine individual, by the way, but we knew Barry, as we then called him, as one of our team members in a secret space project 30 years ago. And now he's been elected twice. He has been honored with the Nobel Peace Prize, and he's certainly one of the signal personalities of my generation. And yet the global public doesn't know that he's a veteran of secret space exploration activities by the United States that were premised on technologies that contemporary society would deem from the realm of science fiction.
Right.
So I think that breakaway civilization has already formed or is in the process of forming.
Mm-hmm.
We really need to make the truth movement to the kind of metaphysical oppression we're under from state secrecy, what the abolition movement was regarding the physical oppression that was embodied in slavery. We have to make the truth movement the leading cause of our time,
Yes.
so that we can reharmonize the connection between government and society and between individuals in society.
When you speak of the Martians and you speak of these people, they want this too for us, like as far as coming back into, this awakening to who we truly are, really.
Actually, this is one of my favorite topics in this area. It's very complex, so bear with me.
Okay.
The jump room building in El Segundo wasn't the Hughes Aircraft headquarters building in El Segundo, but it was then owned and operated by Hughes. Howard Hughes was supposed to have died in 1976, but we now know through the work of investigator Mark Music and the author Douglas Wellman in their book Boxes, The Secret Life of Howard Hughes, that there's overwhelming evidence that Hughes faked his death, and that story of him becoming basically a disheveled, sad figure of an old man there in the mid and late 70s, that he faked that through a double, and that he lived the remainder of his life in Alabama with the woman that he married, changing his name, believe it or not, to Nick Nicely. Now, of course, to nick people nicely is to do well in business with a smile on your face, right? That sounds like the Howard Hughes joke. But I have some non-public information about Mr. Hughes, and that is, I don't want to mention her name because she's asked for anonymity, so I've just shared the information. And that is, an elderly law client of mine in Vancouver, Washington, was a private secretary to Howard Robar Hughes at the El Segundo, California headquarters building of Hughes. And she stated that in the 1970s, when he was still quite strong, in other words, she didn't see any evidence of his decline. This would have been in the early 70s. There's no evidence that he had become disheveled and, was deteriorating physically. He came to her desk and said, Rose, I'll give you her first name, is Rose. Rose, some men are going to be coming to your desk this afternoon with parts for me, named aerospace parts that were wrapped up. They're not from this planet. And by that he meant the men. Be polite to them. He said something like, be polite to them, they're not from our planet, and graciously accept the parts that they're going to drop off at your desk. Now, we also know, again, that Hughes covered up his death, that they were using the story of the Glomar Explorer under the Summa Corporation to kind of tout the really far-out stuff that Hughes was doing towards the supposed end of his life. So I think that part of the Mars jump room cover-up is probably that, especially since Hughes was in alliance with the CIA for a long period of time. I mean, Hughes was traveling around the world with specialized telephones that could not be traced, that he had been provided by the CIA. He was in possession of those in Latin America. So the kind of sidebar story that I'm describing here is relevant. It goes to what really happened to Howard Hughes around the time that the jump rooms to Mars were emerging. Because we know from the account of Michael C. Rell that Michael first took the jump room to Mars in 1976, the very year that Howard Robar Hughes was supposed to have died. So if we look at all the evidence that his decline was fake, the bountiful evidence that Mark Music and Doug Wellman have developed showing that he assumed a false identity and lived another 25 years, dying in 2001. And we look at the fact that Hughes Aircraft has its fingerprints all over the Mars jump room program. I think that the genius behind the jump room program was Howard Hughes personally working with his aerospace engineers in direct liaison with the Martian humanoids. Now you said, do they favor this as well? Well, we know that human typology of Martian humanoid, these would be the descendants who live on Mars, who are in all likelihood the progeny or descendants of the Earthlings who were on Mars at the time of the cataclysm, and then built an advanced civilization under the surface.
Mm-hmm.
We know that that typology of humanoid exists because my father and I met 3 Martian astronauts in the summer of 1970 at an air base in New Jersey. They look like us. Their lung capacity certainly looks a lot bigger. They're very barrel-chested. But they look like modern humans, but their skeleton form and their musculature, as I could discern it as a 9-year-old in the summer of 70, is definitely a departure from our form. Again, they have large heads, large lung capacity because they have large chests, and so forth. But they were operating craft that was certainly more advanced than anything we had at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So they favored, or at least at one point, they favored liaison with us, and certainly still by 1984, that group, and none of the 3 major typologies of humanoids on Mars, were in any way interdicting our efforts. But there is some negative data. What's the negative data? When Barry Obama, Regina Dugan, and I were put into a sequestered environment in the summer of 80 during our training and asked to read through about 4 inches of French intelligence reports in French on the what French intelligence had gathered about Mars and the Martian humanoids. And we were asked to come up with a thesis as to whether the Martian humanoid civilization presented, did not present, or we could not determine whether or not it presented a threat to human life on Earth. Regina Dugan was very bothered by the fact that there was an anecdote in which we had put some of our astronauts in some location on the Martian surface. We had contacted the Martian humanoid civilization like us to rescue them. They had promised to rescue our personnel, and then they reneged and our personnel perished. We also have the shoot down from Phobos of the Russian probe Phobos 2 in 1989. Now that was via a rocket sent from the surface of Phobos. So it looks like we can't presuppose or assume that the Martian humanoid civilization that's related to us still favors our activities on their planet. Maybe after we were going up there in the early 80s, they determined that our hegemonious use of their territorial domain to protect Earth was contrary to their global security interests. Mm-hmm. Second typology are the more diminutive Martians. By the way, I call that first group Homo Maris Terris because they're earthly men and women on Mars. The second group are the ones that are smaller, they have spindlier bodies, they're slighter, they have larger, longer, yet narrower heads with pointier ears than us, longer, more pointy fingers, and they have these very recondite, almost paranoid personalities where they're always sort of looking at Earthlings, wondering whether we're going to do them any harm. Maybe that's a cultural heritage when Earthlings first went to Mars and began to dominate human activities there. Mm-hmm. That group was known to periodically jump one of our chrononauts and eat them. Mm-hmm. So in our training, we were instructed to be somewhat cautious around members of that group because survival conditions on Mars are very, very difficult. Mm-hmm. So you can see how occasionally there would be some cannibalism, just as there are during periods of famine on Earth. I mean, in China, apparently there was mass cannibalism during one of the agricultural revolutions that was a disaster that Mao had sponsored. So that group was not necessarily predisposed to welcome our presence, except maybe occasionally to use some of us as prey. Let me get rid of this Skype phone. Okay. So, and then the third group, by the way, I call that second group Homo Maris Maris because we're presupposing that they're the indigenous Martians. Where they ultimately came from is as mysterious as where we ultimately came from, right? Where humanoid life entered the solar system, probably planted here. But then the third group are the Martian terrestrials who closely resemble the gray extraterrestrials of the UFO literature. Okay. And I call those Homo Maris extraterrestrialis because they're virtually identical to the grays. And there was an incident that I enjoy narrating a lot because it showed that my training kicked in at a certain point. We were trained to communicate with our fellow chrononauts across the grounds, across the surface of Mars, when there was danger especially, in very, very short bursts of meaningful English. So I came out of the jump room first one time with Courtney Hunt of the CIA and my fellow classmate Brett Stillings behind me, out of a jump room that we called the corkscrew because it had sort of a conch shell kind of pattern. And we would walk along this inclined plane on a circle to walk out from the jump room up to the surface. So I came out the opening of that conch shell-like aperture, and I saw a gray extraterrestrial up on the roof at the end of the conch shell, as it were. Mm-hmm. And I yelled out to Courtney and William, "Court, Brett, a gray on the roof, observing us." And so that was the only gray that I saw on the surface. Now, Bernard Mendez, who was the defense investigator of the project and also one of our fellow jumpers and indeed one of our team leaders like Courtney Hunt was when we were traveling to the surface, some of the older individuals who usually lead the team, claims that he was seeing gray ETs much more frequently than that. I went up around 40 times, so God knows how many times Bernie went up, maybe 100 times?
Yeah.
But he definitely reports having more sightings of gray ET-like Martians. But that one was closely holding the roof as if he was more of a terrestrial than the kind of languid, effortless movements that people report of ETs in the contact literature. So I believe that that's a branch of the great ETs, maybe that branched off on Mars when they intervened around 3000 BC on Earth, mm-hmm. and kick-started human, Homo sapiens right. civilization on our planet. But they look like the Greys, but they're a little bit more like lemurs than that, if you will. They look a little bit more equipped to grasp the Earth and branches and things and survive as a terrestrial species.
Right. The thing that is that obviously humanity, we've been around a long time, and yes, disasters have happened, but yet and have been more advanced even,
Yes, it's quite true. And it's also, we have to remember that, we have a conception of being Earthlings, but we have to remember that, the evidence now shows indisputably that not only are we not alone in the universe, but we're not even alone in our own solar system. Mm-hmm. So a kind of a new Copernican revolution is occurring where, in the same way that the Copernican revolution, following Aristarchus of Samos in Greek civilization, determined that we are not at the center of the universe except in a relativistic way, but that indeed we orbit a star, namely the sun. In this new Copernican revolution, to that concept, we're adding the concept that, and we're not even the center of life on this harbinger of life that's planet Earth, because the planet that is our neighboring planet every 2 years, the planet that comes closest to Earth as a planet, not as a moon, namely the planet Mars, is itself inhabited, and not just inhabited with microbial life form or simple life forms, and not just with higher animals, and not just with humanoids, but with different kinds of humanoids. Mm-hmm. So we have to work through a new understanding of our place in the cosmos here in the 21st century and simply accept that and start doing the right things on Earth and then also out in space. That's my hope, that if we can move through that second Copernican revolution in the 21st century, we'll begin to treat all human beings on Earth, and indeed other life forms, as team members on what Mr. Fuller called Spaceship Earth, so that we won't tolerate war and hunger and poverty and disease and intolerance, because we'll recognize that we're on this small spaceship together, and until we take care of everybody in our own civilization, we're not going to have the cosmic right to go out and participate in the greater politics and the great adventure that space holds for us, and indeed that time-space holds. So we're really going to have to spend the next several decades really getting a grasp on what President Kennedy described as the common enemies of humanity, and address them and create a successful civilization here, so we can then take our activities outside the bounds of our planet and be trusted to do so.
Our common enemies. ourselves.
Well, the common enemies, yeah, I mean, can we doubt that we're in some kind of interplanetary quarantine?
Yeah.
When we consider the fact that, as the great ufologist Stanton T. Friedman once observed, our primary spectator sport is vast fratricidal warfare, vast internecine warfare.
Yeah.
And warfare is legally sanctioned mass murder. That can't impress the more advanced hominids who've been observing our global culture.
And so, in a sense, you believe that expanded consciousness, in order to do that, you have to expand a connection, a soul connection to other beings, other human beings.
Yes.
And evolve that way. And then intelligence opens.
Exactly. I believe that, sorry to cut you off there, William, but I believe that knowing the true nature of the cosmos that we inhabit is the common heritage of humankind on Earth. So I believe that these cover-ups have to fall so that we all develop the global consciousness, the planetarian consciousness, that we're simple units of human life in a relatively small planet, in an obscure part of a vast Milky Way galaxy. What is it? We're on the rocker arm of a spiral. We're on the spiral arm of some extension of the Milky Way, 165 million light years from the relative center of that galaxy.
Yes.
We are out in nowhere on a very beautiful planet in an inhabited solar system.
Yeah.
So if we're going to qualify in cosmic terms to become a spacefaring and a time-spacefaring civilization, we're going to have to demonstrate the development of a higher civilization here on Earth. And so I think that these two issues go hand in hand. I believe that the truth embargo needs to fall for that revolution in consciousness to flourish. And when it does, we will then recognize that we need to start treating all 7 billion human beings on our planet as our brothers and sisters and as our team members, so that nobody goes without, and we're all treated as part of the cultivation of civilization here on this planet. I think until we do that, I don't think we're going to be allowed by the extraterrestrial races that have been surveilling us to go out into the wider cosmos. I don't think we can be trusted.
No, I agree with you.
Possessed of rocketry and nuclear weapons, why would they trust us?
And they've shut those down. They can shut those projects down. It seems like in a snap.
In fact, I surveyed the newspaper records of the summer of 1947 when the Roswell crash occurred. There was clear intent by extraterrestrial crafts over every nuclear site on the planet, including Oak Ridge in Tennessee, Hanford in Washington. That's where the Kenneth Arnold sighting occurred by FBI agent Kenneth Arnold. And then above Roswell, which was the only atomic-equipped strategic bomb wing at that time, and other locations. Like during the war in 1942 above Los Angeles, where some of the atomic research contingent was. So yes, since the late 40s, since we began the incredibly cosmically stupid thing of blowing up atomic bombs, which tear at the very physical substrates of the universe,
yes,
we've been under surveillance by more intelligent civilizations, and we should really consider the seriousness of that fact, that our own activities in ionizing, in propagating ionizing radiation have already drawn the attention of more advanced civilizations in our galaxy.
Because what we do here happens, it's so within, so without.
Yes, if we assume that there's symmetry in the universe, presumably a nuclear explosion caused a nuclear implosion across the other side of the galaxy.
Yeah.
So you've already put the universe on notice that, we're a genocidal species. We possess rocketry and now more advanced forms of transportation. And for the last 60, almost going on 70 years, we've been periodically blowing up nuclear weapons for no good reason. Often for very violent genocidal reasons, as we saw at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We see the contamination now of the planet through nuclear energy and events like Fukushima. We're basically blowing it in terms of our final examination to become cosmic citizens. So I'm speaking out so we can become cosmic citizens.
And thank you.
Thank you, Dwayne.
Because we need to hear. We need to hear the truth.
How could I live my life just to remain alive and conceal the fact that as a child 40 years ago, I was involved in the research and development of time travel, where by 1970, 8 modalities from conventional remote viewing on the one hand to reaching the far future via Stargate had already been reduced to practice by DARPA. That my father and I were rubbing elbows with some of the Project Manhattan scientists like Dr. Harold M. Agnew, like Dr. Edward Teller. I was standing next to my father in the hallway at the Los Alamos National Laboratories, where he apprised Dr. Emilio Segre of Project Manhattan on the fact that we were there at the labs on a teleportation project based at Sandia. How could I hold back that 10 years later as a college student in the early 80s, we were going to an elevator either in New York City or in El Segundo, California, and the door was closing, the elevator was morphing from a box-like structure to a cylinder and then correcting itself, and when the door opened, we were on the planet Mars. I mean, I thought, look, when you reach a certain age and a certain degree of life experience, you know, you've seen the Grand Canyon, you've experienced life's pleasures and its creative opportunities and its challenges. At a certain point, you have to stop clinging greedily to life so that you're making your investment in the well-being of future generations.
Yes.
Because you're identifying not with yourself, but with humankind and futurity, what its destiny. And so even though I was threatened by the Bush administration in 2003, that if I didn't stop investigating, talking about, or writing about the time travel technology that I was exposed to, they, quote, couldn't guarantee my survival, which I took to be either a warning or a threat. It was probably a threat. Nonetheless, I told them I was going to shut up, and then the next year I gave my first lecture. It was in October of 2004, because I thought, well, ultimately people don't matter. What matters, as Captain Jacques Cousteau said, is what matters is principles, purposes, and projects. You know, what principles do we form? What purposes do we form to implement those principles? And how do we articulate those purposes into concrete projects that help humanity cope with its need to achieve life support and to construct a sustainable civilization on behalf of future generations? So I thought, well, I'll begin speaking out even if I lose my life doing this, because at least I will have died for a meaningful purpose. And so that's been motivating me, is the thought that, you know, every once in a while I get very dejected because I've received a lot of abuse from the public by those who believe that I'm lying or crazy, or they're on some level envious that they weren't involved. It kind of threatens some people's ego. And I get very castigating emails and comments on Facebook that I am crazy or I am lying, and usually those insults are based on profanities and vulgarities rather than just on character judgments. And then maybe I'll go out shopping for groceries or something, and I see a little child. And all of the weariness from taking that undeserved contempt melts away. Because I look at a little child walking with his mother and some little 2 or 3-year-old, and I say, that child is going to teleport between Los Angeles and New York City in 2 seconds to go see a Broadway play with their high school friends, because I had the courage to speak out about these technologies being developed 40 years ago when I was there. So it's all worth it.
And be friends with other races.
Yes, and have the opportunity to go to a convention on Mars and meet the different typologies at a summit meeting on Mars and meet some of the young people from their culture and speak with them, because some of the Martian humanoids that are our genetic relatives on Mars actually speak English. The ones that my father and I met at that airbase in New York City certainly did.
Yeah.
So this is what the 21st century holds for the next generations, and when I can identify with those kids and the notion that, let's say, that little 2 or 3-year-old girl is going to grow up and get pregnant and not be on an airliner where her pregnancy is going to be at risk from radiation, where she might have a miscarriage or her child might have birth defects because she decided or needed to take an airplane ride during her pregnancy, but will be able to zip through time-space with minimal impacts, I feel good about everything I'm doing because I know I'll be having a positive impact on the lives of those kids when they grow up.
Yes.
Probably more than. If we're able to achieve global teleportation by 2020, that's only 7 years away, and that's the milestone that I've set for my Truth campaign, which is I hope to promote the international discourse on teleportation so that we achieve global public teleportation between major cities by 2020.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's the goal. But and the awareness seems to be increasing. I mean, my Project Pegasus site on Facebook, I had set a milestone of 10,000 members by this Christmas, back in May.
Mm-hmm.
We'll probably see 10,000 members by the 4th of July.
Yeah.
I mean, I add 3 people and do some law work and come back 45 minutes later.
There's more. There's more.
So my Truth campaign is taking off. I've been on a number of major television programs now, and awareness is increasing that we have the tools to create a sustainable civilization in the 20th century. The political challenge is that many of the most important ones need to be declassified and deployed by the U.S. government.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be difficult, not only to declassify, but to deploy, because we're going to have to create an international system of teleports that cannot be commandeered by local national governments or military forces on the one hand, or organized groups of criminals or terrorists on the other. So there are some profound technical impediments that we're going to have to overcome, not to constructing the teleport network, but to making it safe.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a major public policy challenge ahead of us for this generation of political leaders around the world, if we're going to implement what we can do, which is create a world where teenagers in California can have their high school prom in Paris and come home for dinner.
Mm-hmm. And much more.
And much more. We'll be able to take workers in downtown Manhattan will be able to go to lunch in Paris and come back to their office.
That's right.
Simultaneously.
Well, thank you very much. I've kept you over the hour. I don't know how if there's anything that you'd like to say to everyone in closing, a message you'd like to leave?
Yes, Dwayne, I would just like to reach your viewers that with the fact that I'm telling the truth, I'm standing in my truth, my facts have not wavered, they're true, they're based on life experience serving in Darkest Project Pegasus in the early 70s and in the CIA's Mars jump room program of the early 1980s. If you want to follow that literature, I would invite all of your viewers to join me in my groups Project Pegasus and Mars Anomaly Research Society on Facebook, because that's where the very dynamic discourse about these two areas of human functioning in the universe is going on today. And please lobby your national governments to contact me. I'm using an open, transparent strategy. I've always said that I would testify about my experiences to the President of the United States or the U.S. Congress, and also consult any other world government leaders about these time-space capabilities that the U.S. government developed in the early 1970s and that we can and will be using to revolutionize human life on Earth in the 21st century.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dwayne.
And I guess we'll sign off for now. I'd like to interview you again sometime.
I'd be happy.
There's much more that I had on my list to ask you, but I never got to.
Okay, well, let's make this a regular thing. I'm just here in my law offices in Vancouver, Washington.
Okay.
Look forward to chatting with you again.
Okay, thank you. Take care.
Thank you, Dwayne.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.